We're moving on to David Berliner's work. His work helps us appreciate the role social class plays in shaping children's educational experiences. Berliner points out that when people are concerned about educational achievement of poor children, they often focus their reform efforts on what is happening inside the classroom. But what they fail to consider is the fact that children in schools are situated in neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods are often segregated by social class and race. I'd like to start with a local example to demonstrate this point. So what I did was I conducted a search of homes or homes for sale that were valued at $100,000 or less. These homes would be for a household that earns a little over $33,000. And so those are that's really modest income. And I want you to notice that the houses cluster in the center of the city here, right? And then they also are located here. And this right here is the ship channel. And this area right here is referred to as Refinery Row, because that's where heavy industry is. And we'll come back to this observation later during the lecture because it's gonna connect to schooling and achievement. Okay, so that was basically like a quick search for low cost home ownership opportunities. Now here, I did another search for homes whose values or for sale values were $750,000 or more. Households who could afford these types of homes would have to earn at least $250,000 a year, which puts them in the top 5% of the households here in Corpus. And again, so it's the more really affluent segments of our society that could of our community that could even afford these houses. And I want you to notice that these houses kind of cluster on the far south side and then out on the island. And I think these just quick searches illustrate the point made by Parsons and Berliner that neighborhoods are economically homogeneous. If we toggle between the two screens, you'll see that the cluster of really modest price homes are not near the clusters of affluently priced homes. So these kids would, in essence, be attending different schools. I also wanted to show you how communities are racially segregated. This is a color-coded map for Corpus Christi. Corpus Christi is 28.8% non-Hispanic white and 63.8% Hispanic and 4% Black. Notice that the Hispanic population, which is this color right here and this right here, the Hispanic population is concentrated in the middle and west side of the city. You can see the non-Hispanic white population, which are more tan colors, concentrated. So the tan color here, right, are concentrated along Ocean Drive in the island. And then you can kind of see these clusters of tan on the far south side. We see some mixing of the groups at the far south side. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put both maps side by side. So here is the 75K or the 750, the homes that are $750,000 or more, right? The homes for sale. So here in this section, and then you can see it corresponds to this section right here. Again, more white individuals, but again, white population is only 28.8% of the city and is clustered in certain geographic spaces. Now here is the homes priced at $100,000 or less. And then the race map, and you can see there's strong similarities between the two. And again, we'll return to this in a bit, but first I want to show you a couple of other examples because this doesn't just happen in our region, it's like across the country, right? So this is a race and ethnicity dot density map from the 2020 census for the New York area, and you can actually see that you've got these kind of concentrations of Asian communities. The yellow is Black or African American communities. The tan is the white communities, and then that bluish, grayish, greenish here are Latino communities. And again, oh, I guess like this isn't just people choosing to live by one another. This pattern that we see here is something that persists after more than 50 years, after race-based zoning and steering and redlining that required racial groups to live in specific neighborhoods, um, was outlawed. And well, again, we'll talk more about this later. This is the Houston area. And again, the 10 is for non-Hispanic whites. So you see that here, concentrated here. The yellow is black communities. The bluish, grayish, greenish is the Latino or Hispanic areas. This is Austin, right? So you see predominantly white, and then you've got clusters of Hispanic, and then you have clusters of black here and black here interspersed, and then Asian up here. This is San Antonio. And again, you can see the concentration of Hispanics along the southern and western areas of San Antonio, with white non-Hispanic whites being clustered along the northeast segment. And then you can see the yellow tinge here with disproportionate clustering of African Americans. And again, this is evidence that there are these social and economic geographies that exist in our communities, and it has powerful implications that are often ignored when education reform just focuses on what's happening inside the classroom. Okay, so Berliner tells us that for every hour a child spends in a classroom, they spend 5 hours with family and in a community. And in the United States, the quality of resources and services a child has access to is a function of how much they can pay for them. So if you're a child and your family has money, your quality of life and access to resources and quality of education, even public education, is qualitatively better and different than if you're a child who comes from a family that lives below the poverty threshold. Our society, relative to other countries, has a very poor social safety net. One, private industry, especially toxic industries like the fossil fuel industries we find along Refinery Row, are very weakly regulated, and often they just have to monitor themselves. Two, we don't have universal health care in the United States. Healthcare is something that you have to purchase, and so that limits accessibility. Three, affordable housing for low-income families is difficult to come by, and things like grocery stores and access to quality foods actually varies by social class and neighborhoods, with poor neighborhoods more likely to experience things called food deserts. Compared to other rich nations, the US is a leader in child poverty, and that child poverty has a lifetime of implications. And when we speak of poverty in the United States, the way poverty is conceptualized is the cost of a nutritionally adequate diet per person in a household times 3. Based on the cost of basic goods like food and housing related expenses, people earning below the poverty threshold do not, and I repeat, do not earn enough to meet their basic needs. This definition is important because people living below that poverty threshold means that people are living in a constant state of crisis and insecurity, and that has real implications for children. Contrary to popular belief, though, most poverty that people experience is actually episodic. Life events like sickness, a divorce, a birth of a child, especially an unplanned birth, a job loss, often propels families into poverty. This doesn't have to be the case, though, but rather is a product of our decision as a nation and as a state to not ensure that people have access to health care, quality housing, living wages, or access to unemployment insurance should they lose their jobs. When families are in economic crisis, their children are impacted. When families are in economic crisis, they're living in neighborhoods with concentrations of other families in economic crises. The implications for children living in those neighborhoods and attending schools with other children whose families are in economic crisis or near crisis, that has major implications for children, and we're going to be talking about those extensively with this article. Ed reformers ignore the correlation between poverty and academic achievement, instead focusing on things like the low expectations of teachers or the quality of teachers that are in the schools. And this deflects our attention away from what's happening outside of the schools, in part because by focusing on just what happens inside the schools does not require us to question the social organization of our society and the impact of an unequal distribution of economic resources. Now, this isn't about low income people not being as smart as high income people. And I can't stress that enough. This isn't like a social Darwinistic uh, argument. This is about the impact of living in a state of crisis where your basic needs cannot be met. And it's about living in a society that has plenty of resources, making choices to not provide quality public resources or quality resources for people, right? And impacting and living in a constant state of crisis where you're not able to meet your basic needs is really very much akin to like being a plant and not being able to thrive because the soil doesn't have adequate nutrients or enough water. Berliner turns to illustrate or turns to international tests to illustrate his point. So you may be familiar with some of those tests where they compare US students with students from other countries. And what he has right here is showing that there's a correlation between the poverty rates of schools and academic achievement. When poverty rates at schools are low, students' average scores on these tests, those schools with low poverty rates actually exceed the national average score. When schools have high concentrations of poverty, not only are they below our national average score, they're often below the international average score. And when the schools have I already said that. When schools have right high concentrations of poverty, 75% or more, their scores right here dip below the international average. And what we see at the individual level is that poverty can really suppress the expression of genes. The chart on page 502 shows the percent of variation in IQ attributable to a shared family environment across various levels of socioeconomic status. And so as the economic status of a family gets higher, the amount of variation shared by the family environment actually shifts. And what that means, right? It's that variation declines as the income level increases. So why is that? Again, I want you to think of that analogy of a plant being able to grow, and that that being an expression of a child's potential and its relationship to its economic status, right? So if a seed is planted in an environment that has been plagued with drought or whose soil has not been nurtured with nutrients, then regardless of what the genes are of the seed, that seed's ability to express itself in the development of the plant is going to be compromised by the environment that it's planted in. And so, the inverse is also true, right? If the seed is planted in nutrient-rich soil with adequate water, then when we watch the plant grow, we are seeing an expression of its genes. And this is how you can think about the charts that I have here. So in these two figures, from pages 509 and 510, we see a kind of affirmation of this idea. So in the first chart, what we see is this solid line, right? And we're looking at when a household experiences a significant increase in its income. And so we're, moving toward having right significantly more household income. And what the research by Deering, McCartney, and Taylor show is that a positive increase in income, especially for low income families, tends to correlate with an increase in positive social behaviors. And that increase is pretty dramatic. Now, this other dotted line right here is also showing the changes in pro-social behaviors among non-poor families, and kind of the same degree of change in the household income, right? So it's the same proportion of change. And again, what we're looking at is, there seems to be a slight increase in pro-social behaviors, but the lines looks really close to flat. Whereas an increase of income for the low income has this kind of dramatic impact on pro-social behaviors. And the same thing holds true for school readiness. As people's income increases, poor people's income increases, so does school readiness. But when we're looking at non-poor people, as their income increases, yes, there's a modest increase in school readiness, but it's not really dramatic. Where the big change happens is for people who are poor, experiencing a shift, an increase in their household income levels that take them from being well below the poverty line to above the poverty line. Right. And again, we have to think about those families who are living below the poverty line, and how that poverty line is indicative of a family not being able to meet its basic needs. And not being able to meet material needs also has an impact on stress and anxiety that families feel because they're in a constant state of insecurity. And then that impacts their relationship with their children and their ability to engage with their children. So poverty matters, right? And it has a real and measurable impact on students' ability to learn, to be ready for school, right? To do well on achievement tests. Now, Berliner also looks at performances on international tests for schools by the racialized identity of students. Note the average US score on this table for math was a 493, right? And when you look at the average score for white students, non-Hispanic white students, you see their average score is 530. Which is well above the US average. And then if you look at the Hispanic students, United States Hispanic students and African American students, their scores are well below the US average. Now, I don't want you to jump to the conclusion that white students are smarter than Black or Hispanic students. The reality is that white rates of poverty vary dramatically. I'm sorry, that rates of poverty vary dramatically by race. For example, in 2016, the poverty rate for for white children, non-Hispanic white children, was 11%. But for Black children, it was 34%. So it was more than 3 times higher than the non-Hispanic white children's poverty rate. And for Hispanic children, the poverty rate was around 28%. And so concentrations also vary pretty dramatically by region. For example, Hispanic and Black children are far more likely to find themselves living in communities that have high concentrations of poverty and high concentrations of children of color. And because schools are neighborhood schools, those schools tend to have high concentrations of children living below the poverty line as well. And so what's taking place in the community has a profound impact on what learning can happen in the classroom. And I want us to go back to those images I showed you of Corpus and the overlap between the lower income homes for sale and the racialized dispersions. These are social and economic geographies, right? Just kind of taking a look at that. And that's because we're focusing on homeownership opportunities and not on rents. And what's even more important to know is that Corpus Christi is not a manifestation of the strongest correlations between racialized identities and poverty rates. And the impact of poverty is more than just what happens inside of a household, because of other social institutions like the healthcare industry and government regulations and the way that like government operates, especially as it relates to regulations and, creating safe and healthy environments. So, for example, access to healthcare, as I said before, is not a right, it's a commodity. It's something that must be purchased, not something that's a social good available to all people. In other rich countries and even in poor ones, healthcare is a right, and people often have better outcomes in the United States, even though we spend more money per capita on healthcare. And there are real consequences for this. For example, otitis media is basically like I guess, the medical terminology for ear infections. People without health insurance are more likely to let such issues go untreated or use home remedies. Some of which you may be familiar with. I actually put a picture up here of somebody rolling up a cone with a newspaper. Um, and some people do these newspaper cone treatments. You roll up a newspaper into a cone and you put the pointy tip in your ear. Then you light the other end of the cone with a lighter, and there's a fire, right, burning in this sphere of the newspaper cone. And what's supposed to happen is, or what's believed to happen is that fire, right, it needs oxygen to burn, so it pulls the air or the pressure out of and out of the ear and relieves the pressure. um and repeated earaches, and untreated earaches, treat like home remedies, treatments such as these can damage the ear, which also affects hearing, which can affect language, which also impacts the ability to work on your reading skills, right? Because hearing things is important to like decoding. Similarly, vision screening is another health related issue. While mass vision screenings do take place at schools, and schools will allow families, or will notify families that their students have a vision deficiency. Families then have to take their children to an optometrist to do another screening and get glasses. And this is really expensive. And often that initial screening that happened at school is not enough or not accepted by optometrists. And they are not sufficient to be able to get corrective measures. Thus, students may not actually go with may not actually get their deficiencies addressed. In fact, there was one study that Berliner highlighted where less than half of the students who were identified as having a visual deficiency didn't actually get their deficiency corrected um, upon learning that they needed some sort of they needed glasses. And not having your vision corrected affects your ability to engage in the classroom and to learn, right? And this isn't just about parents not wanting to take their kids to the doctor. It's about not being able to afford taking your kid to an eye doctor. Low income jobs tend to have less access to health insurance, and when health insurance is an option, oftentimes families can't afford to purchase the insurance because they need that money that they're earning to pay bills. And so health insurance becomes almost like a luxury as opposed to a necessity. And there's another component too, because you might say, well, why don't they just go ahead and apply for government assistance? Because there are government assistance programs. Well, the reality is that those government assistance programs require people to go to office visits, bring their bills and documentation, and they have to fill out an application. And this can, take a whole day or a half day in order for people to even just be able to apply for those kinds of resources. And if you're a low income worker, you're likely to be working an hourly job, and being away from work means not getting paid, and not getting paid means not being able to pay your bills. And so, some people just can't afford to do those types of things. And so they elect to go without. And so again, access to care, to healthcare, and the affordability of healthcare has profound consequences for children. On top of that, we also see that asthma rates and lead exposures are a function of environmental conditions. For example, low-income communities of color are much more likely to be located by toxic environments. These toxic environments literally make children sicker. We see higher rates of asthma and learning disabilities and congenital heart issues as a result of living by these toxic environments. And we see higher rates of cancer and other chronic conditions among adults that live near in close proximity to those toxic environments as well. And oftentimes people wind up living in those spaces because the rents are cheaper in those areas. So, those people, because of their limited economic resources, wind up being put in these really vulnerable positions. And then those industries are not well regulated. They're given permits to actually pollute the environment and pollute the surrounding areas. And that pollution has real consequences for those living in close proximity. Just think about those affordable homes that I showed you along Refinery Row. And we know that these relationships exist but the government continues to issue those permits and fails to monitor those industries while people suffer the consequences. My own students have done research on a research project on this where they showed a correlation between a major disruption at a refinery and a decline in attendance at an elementary school that was less than a mile away from the disruption, and the decline of attendance had actually persisted for multiple days. Pollution and volatile organic compounds spewing in the air cause asthma. They trigger asthmatic episodes and lead to kids missing school. And when kids miss school, they miss opportunities to learn. And there's documented evidence that shows the more frequent people are absent from school, the lower they tend to score on standardized tests, right? Similarly, we also see, again, kind of going back to this idea of like regulating and regulations and ensuring that people live in clean and healthy environments. We see that poor neighborhoods tend to be older neighborhoods and have older schools. And those older neighborhoods and older schools are much more likely to have lead in their environments. Public health officials state that there are no safe lead levels in environments. Exposure to lead, even really small amounts, leads to learning disabilities, hyperactivity, attention deficit syndrome. It leads to learning issues and behavioral issues in the classroom. And here, this graph is taken from, or this figure is taken from page 505, and we can see lead detection in schools by the years that the schools were built. Notice the exponential difference in the exposure to lead by the year the school's built. Older schools are more likely to be attended by poorer children. So poorer children are basically experiencing threats to their health and their learning and their ability to learn and their future because of the choices that heavy industry makes, because of the priorities of government and their failure to make sure that children's needs are met, that their environments are clean. They center the profits of industry, whether that be the fossil fuel industry or the healthcare industry, rather than centering the environment within which people and children live their lives, rather than centering the fact that people can and do get sick and need to be tended to. And what researchers have been able to show is that there are things that have a positive impact on children's outcomes, but these programs cost money and require us to think about how things outside the classroom affect things inside the classroom. And some of this knowledge has been around for decades. It's well established, and yet reformers continue to focus on that 1 hour in the classroom instead of the 5 hours outside of the classroom. And why? Well, from a conflict theorist perspective, it's because by focusing on what's happening inside the classroom, we don't have to think critically about how the social organization of society is producing problems. We don't have to change a system that is already benefiting those who have and those who can avoid the toxic environments and who can afford to pay for health insurance and who can afford expensive houses and expensive neighborhoods that have schools who will only educate similarly situated families. And in that respect, right, our social organization of society has a profound impact on students' life chances, their ability to be healthy, to learn, and to be engaged in those school environments.